Verdant Hill was a small, picturesque town nestled in the American Midwest, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and lives intertwined like the roots of the town's ancient trees. The streets were quiet and lined with charming homes, each one meticulously cared for. Among the residents, the Whitfield family was held in high regard, upstanding, respectable, and seemingly perfect. But, as with many small towns, appearances could be deceiving, and Verdant Hill was about to learn that even the most ideal lives can harbor dark secrets. Eleanor Whitfield was a beloved figure in the town, known for her kindness and grace. She spent her days volunteering at local events, helping her neighbors, and supporting her husband, Marcus Whitfield. Marcus was a dedicated historian with a serious demeanor, his life wrapped in books and research. His intense focus on work often left Eleanor feeling isolated. She'd married him with dreams of a vibrant life together, but over time, his commitment to his studies created a chasm between them. A source of comfort in Eleanor's life was Horatio Whitfield, Marcus's father. Horatio was a retired professor, an intellectual with a lively spirit, and a knack for charming those around him. After the passing of his wife, he moved closer to his son and daughter-in-law, finding in Eleanor a confidant and companion. With Marcus frequently absorbed in his work, Eleanor and Horatio spent more time together, bonding over shared interests and moments of laughter, often missing from her marriage. Their relationship, though innocent at first, gradually transformed into something more intense. Eleanor's yearning for connection and Horatio's loneliness merged, and what began as friendly companionship grew into a forbidden romance. It was a line neither of them had anticipated crossing, yet once crossed, it couldn't be undone. As the months wore on, neighbors in Verdant Hill started to notice Eleanor's increasing visits to Horatio's home, especially in the evenings when Marcus was away. Among the most observant was Bernice Caldwell, a neighbor with a penchant for gossip. Living across the street from the Whitfields, Bernice had a clear view of Horatio's front door, and it didn't escape her that Eleanor was frequently seen entering his house alone. To Bernice, these visits were more than just friendly family exchanges. Her suspicions, though kept to herself for the time being, simmered, feeding into the town's growing curiosity. Yet, in a community that valued discretion, most people dismissed any oddities, brushing them off as typical neighborly assistants. Eleanor's flawless reputation shielded her from most scrutiny, and Horatio's amiable demeanor reassured anyone who might have questioned the nature of their bond. They had, it seemed, perfected the art of keeping secrets behind closed doors. But as winter set in, Eleanor was hit with a revelation that would forever alter the course of her life. She discovered she was pregnant, a shocking realization that sent her reeling. There was no doubt in her mind that Horatio, not Marcus, was the father. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on her, bringing with it a flood of guilt and fear. How could she face Marcus, and what would the town think if her secret was revealed? Eleanor's demeanor began to change. The once bright smile she wore for the town dimmed. Her eyes lost their sparkle, and her laughter became strained. Neighbors noticed, and although no one voiced their concerns directly, whispers started circulating. Bernice, ever vigilant, took particular interest in Eleanor's transformation, adding fuel to the simmering rumors. Horatio, too, felt the pressure mounting. While he tried to reassure Eleanor, the implications of their actions weighed heavily on him. His guilt was compounded by the fear of losing Marcus's trust and the respect of the community he had cherished. Yet, in stolen moments together, neither Eleanor nor Horatio could deny the intense bond they shared. Their connection, though fraught with danger, offered a solace neither of them could find elsewhere. As they navigated this new reality, tensions in the Whitfield home reached an all-time high. Marcus, oblivious to the true nature of Eleanor's distress, attributed her withdrawal to fatigue or perhaps the onset of winter blues. He continued with his routines, unaware that his marriage was teetering on the edge of collapse. The stage was set for the tragedy that would soon shatter the peace of Verdant Hill. Beneath the serene surface of the Whitfields' life, a storm was brewing, one that would test the very foundations of the family and the town itself. And while Verdant Hill prided itself on being a place where secrets were rare, the Whitfields' secret was anything but small. The Whitfields' home was still, cloaked in the calm that came only in the late hours of night. Eleanor lay awake, listening to the soft sounds of Marcus's breathing beside her. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing, tangled in a web of thoughts and emotions she could barely process. The depth of her guilt gnawed at her, yet she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward Horatio. He had become her refuge, her secret, and though she knew how wrong it was, Eleanor clung to that solace like a lifeline. As winter approached, their rendezvous became more frequent and increasingly passionate. Marcus's obliviousness, combined with his long hours at work, offered Eleanor and Horatio the freedom to pursue their forbidden relationship. Each encounter was a careful orchestration, concealed beneath the veneer of familial visits, but beneath the surface, their connection grew more reckless and consuming. One frigid evening, Eleanor received a call from Horatio. His voice was calm, yet carried an urgency that sent a chill down her spine. He had been thinking about her, he said, unable to ignore the ache that had lodged itself in his heart. They agreed to meet later that night at his home, a mere block away from the Whitfields. Eleanor knew the risks, yet the idea of seeing Horatio, if only for a few stolen hours, was irresistible. Slipping on her coat and leaving Marcus a note about a supposed late-night errand, she quietly made her way through the snowy streets to Horatio's house. The town lay in a blanket of silence, with only the crunch of her boots on the frost-covered path breaking the stillness. She arrived, and with a gentle knock, Horatio welcomed her in, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and sadness. Inside, they sat together by the dim glow of the fireplace, their fingers entwined, words unnecessary. Horatio ran a hand through her hair, his touch both tender and laden with regret. He knew what they were doing was wrong, yet he found himself unable to resist. Eleanor had become the light in his life, an antidote to years of loneliness and grief. They kissed, their breaths mingling as they each tried to drown out the overwhelming guilt that plagued them. In these moments, they could pretend that the world outside didn't exist, that their lives weren't bound by duty and betrayal. But the reality of their situation always lingered, hovering like a dark shadow, waiting to claim its toll. As Eleanor returned home later that night, slipping back into bed beside Marcus, she was unaware that her brief journey had not gone unnoticed. Across the street, Bernice Caldwell peered through her curtains. Her curiosity piqued by Eleanor's late-night excursion, Bernice's eyes narrowed as she watched Eleanor disappear into Horatio's house, her mind racing with the implications. Bernice knew the Whitfields well, and her instinct told her that something was amiss. But, knowing how quickly gossip spread in Verdant Hill, she kept her suspicions to herself, waiting for more evidence. She made a mental note to keep an eye on Eleanor's comings and goings, sure that a story was unfolding before her very eyes. As the weeks passed, Eleanor began to feel an unsettling change in her body, an unexpected fatigue, waves of nausea that struck her at odd hours, and an unmistakable sense that something was different. At first, she dismissed these signs as the effects of stress, perhaps even guilt manifesting physically. But as time went on, the truth became undeniable. She was pregnant. The realization hit her like a shockwave, leaving her reeling. Eleanor knew immediately that the child could not be Marcus's. Their marriage had grown cold and distant, and they had shared no intimacy in recent months. The only possibility was Horatio. The weight of this truth settled heavily on her chest, leaving her feeling trapped and terrified. Eleanor struggled to maintain her composure, especially around Marcus, who, though largely oblivious to her inner turmoil, began to sense her growing distance. The few times he asked about her well-being, she deflected his questions, attributing her behavior to winter fatigue. Yet the prospect of hiding a pregnancy weighed on her like an anchor, filling her with dread. She knew she couldn't keep this secret forever. One evening, when Marcus was away at a conference, Eleanor made her way to Horatio's house, her mind racing. She had to tell him. She couldn't face this alone. As she knocked on his door, her hands trembled. When he opened the door, a look of concern crossed his face as he took in her expression. They sat in his study, a heavy silence between them as Eleanor gathered her courage. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm pregnant," she said, her eyes locked on Horatio's. The words hung in the air, heavy and charged with the weight of their implications. Horatio's face paled, and he sank back into his chair, visibly shaken. He ran a hand over his face, struggling to process what he'd just heard. In that moment, he realized the full extent of the damage they had wrought, the lives they had jeopardized with their affair. What are we going to do?" he asked, his voice breaking. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, the hopelessness of their situation crashing over her. She had no answers, no way to explain or justify the choices that had led them to this point. All she knew was that this child, this unplanned life, would shatter everything they had tried so hard to protect. Horatio reached out, clasping her hand tightly, as if grounding himself in her touch. They sat together in the silence, both fully aware of the storm that was about to descend upon them. There was no escaping the consequences now. They were on a collision course with disaster, and there was no turning back. In the days following their confrontation, the atmosphere in the Whitfield home grew strained. Eleanor's composure became increasingly fragile. and Marcus, though oblivious to the specifics, couldn't ignore the tension simmering between Eleanor and Horatio whenever they were together. He noticed Eleanor avoiding eye contact with Horatio, and there were moments when Horatio's gaze lingered on her longer than seemed appropriate. The odd tension between his wife and father gnawed at Marcus. He tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to family stress. Yet a sense of unease settled in his gut, lingering like a shadow. Late one night, Marcus found himself staring at Eleanor as she slept, his mind racing with questions he couldn't quite put into words. One evening, during a family dinner, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He glanced between Eleanor and Horatio, noting the way they seemed to avoid each other's gaze, the tightness in their smiles. Bernice Caldwell, who happened to join them for dinner that night, watched the dynamic with barely concealed interest, her eyes darting between Eleanor and Horatio as she mentally cataloged every glance and gesture. After dinner, Marcus pulled Eleanor aside, his eyes filled with concern. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice laced with worry. Eleanor managed a weak smile, her heart pounding as she struggled to maintain her facade. "I'm just tired," she replied, her voice wavering. She turned away, not daring to look him in the eye, fearful that he would see the truth. As the night wore on, Marcus found himself restless, haunted by an unshakable feeling that his life was unraveling in ways he couldn't yet understand. Little did he know, the foundation of the Whitfield family was cracking, and the secrets concealed within its walls were on the verge of exploding. Winter's chill had settled over Verdant Hill, and inside the Whitfield home, the tension simmered like a tightly coiled spring, ready to snap. Eleanor moved through her evening routines mechanically, each task laden with the burden of her secrets. For weeks, she had felt Marcus's gaze follow her, his eyes shadowed with a growing suspicion. Her husband's once trusting nature had shifted into something darker, and each passing day, Eleanor could sense him drawing nearer to the truth. Her dread culminated one evening when Marcus came across an innocuous piece of paper that served as the final clue. A receipt from a secluded hotel lay tucked into the pocket of her coat, its date matching a night when she'd been running errands while Marcus was out of town. Finding it by chance, he felt his breath catch as he connected the dots. The knowledge of his wife's betrayal washed over him in a cold, painful wave, confirming what he had been dreading. When Eleanor returned home that night, she found Marcus waiting for her in the kitchen, the slip of paper on the counter before him. The weight of his discovery was evident in the hard set of his jaw, the tight grip on the counter's edge. It was clear from his expression that he knew everything, and the fragile facade she'd maintained collapsed. She felt as if the walls were closing in around her, every excuse she might have clung to dissolving in the face of his silent accusation. As Marcus's restrained fury threatened to break, Horatio, sensing the storm brewing, entered the room. He had been staying over that night, a routine that once offered familial warmth, but now served as a glaring reminder of their deception. The sight of his father only magnified Marcus's rage, the betrayal cutting him deeply. In that moment, a lifetime of trust and respect between father and son evaporated. Without words, Marcus's anger exploded. He lunged at Horatio, his raw emotions driving his movements as he shoved his father back against the counter. The men grappled, a desperate struggle fueled by years of unspoken resentment and shattered loyalty. Eleanor watched, frozen in place, her heart pounding as she realized the irreversible consequences of her actions. Panic and terror gripped her, her voice lost as she watched Marcus wrestle Horatio, the sounds of their scuffle filling the quiet house. Amid the chaos, Horatio's hand scrambled across the counter, his fingers finding an object with a cold, metallic feel, the antique letter opener. Without thought, driven purely by survival and fear, he plunged it forward. In an instant, the blade found its mark as Marcus staggered back, his face etched with shock and betrayal as he clutched his side, his blood seeping through his fingers. Eleanor rushed forward, trying to press down on the wound, but the damage was done. Marcus's life was slipping away, his breath shallow and labored as he looked into her eyes, a silent question echoing his disbelief. Her vision blurred as he exhaled his last breath, leaving her alone in the suffocating quiet. The man she had once loved, now gone because of her betrayal. A terrible silence fell over the room, broken only by the distant sound of a neighbor's dog barking. Horatio stood motionless, the reality of his actions settling upon him with crushing force. He looked at Eleanor, his expression mirroring her horror, but now a new fear gripped them both. The realization of what they had done, and the implications of Marcus's death, was too immense to process. Desperate, Eleanor's mind raced. Panic-stricken, she knew that if the police discovered Marcus's body in the house, it would lead to questions, exposure, and punishment beyond what they could bear. In a moment of frenzied desperation, she turned to Horatio, urging him to help her hide what had happened. They had already crossed every moral boundary. Now they were beyond redemption, ensnared in their own web. In the early hours of the morning, under the cover of darkness, they wrapped Marcus's lifeless body in a blanket. Every sound seemed amplified as they carried him out through the back door, their footsteps crunching in the snow as they moved toward Horatio's car. Fear clung to them with every step, but they pushed forward, driven by the need to keep their secret buried. They drove in silence, the journey fraught with dread as they made their way to an isolated spot on the edge of town, near an abandoned field where few ventured during the cold winter months. Together, they worked in grim silence, digging through the frozen earth. With numb fingers and shivering bodies, they lowered Marcus into the hastily dug grave, their breaths visible in the icy air as they covered him with soil. When they returned home, the reality of their actions weighed heavily upon them. Eleanor felt an overwhelming wave of guilt and nausea wash over her, but there was no way back. They had crossed an irrevocable line, and now their only choice was to maintain the illusion of innocence. Exhausted, they scrubbed the kitchen floor, wiping away the bloodstains, their hands trembling with every stroke. As dawn broke, Eleanor and Horatio stood in the kitchen, their faces hollow and worn, the smell of bleach lingering in the air. They had managed to clean up the evidence, but the memories of the night's events clung to them like a curse. The house felt suffocating, filled with the ghosts of the life they had destroyed, but they steeled themselves, vowing to keep the truth buried as deeply as Marcus. In the days that followed, Eleanor played the role of the grieving widow with a flawless performance. Her mask concealing the turmoil within, she attended the usual community gatherings, accepting condolences with a strained smile. But her mind remained clouded, each encounter tinged with fear and paranoia, the constant worry that someone might see through her facade. She avoided the curious gaze of Bernice Caldwell, the neighborhood gossip, who had already begun to whisper about Marcus's sudden disappearance. Eleanor and Horatio told everyone that Marcus had left town on a work-related trip, a story that seemed plausible enough to most. But Detective Valerie Gaines, a seasoned investigator in Verdant Hill, found herself unsettled by the rumors. She had known Marcus in passing and was familiar with his routines. His sudden disappearance felt off, especially given the strangeness of Eleanor's behavior since he'd gone. As the days turned into weeks, Detective Gaines began piecing together the small inconsistencies in the story. She noticed that Horatio and Eleanor appeared strained, their interactions tense and stilted. Bernice Caldwell's subtle hints about late-night disturbances and unusual behavior only fueled her suspicions, prompting Valerie to look deeper into Marcus's life and relationships. Her investigation led her to the abandoned field on the outskirts of town. The rumors about Marcus's disappearance, combined with her own hunches, had led her to suspect foul play. As she surveyed the area, Detective Gaines found herself lingering near a section of recently disturbed earth. She ordered a team to investigate further, and soon they uncovered what Eleanor and Horatio had tried so desperately to hide. The discovery of Marcus's body sent shockwaves through Verdant Hill. News of the crime spread quickly, casting a shadow over the small town that had once prided itself on its tranquility. Eleanor and Horatio's carefully constructed facade began to crumble as the investigation intensified, the secrets they had buried rising to the surface one by one. In the wake of Marcus's death, Verdant Hill was forever changed. Friends and neighbors reeled from the revelation, struggling to reconcile the image of the Whitfield family they had known with the dark reality that had been hidden behind closed doors. Eleanor's carefully cultivated image fell apart as detectives began questioning her alibi and examining the inconsistencies in her story. Detective Gaines, now armed with undeniable evidence, began to piece together the twisted puzzle. She sifted through phone records, scrutinized Eleanor's financial transactions, and uncovered witness statements that pointed to the growing tensions within the Whitfield household. Every piece of evidence confirmed the suspicions she had held from the beginning, that Marcus's death was no accident, but a deliberate act of betrayal and desperation. As Eleanor and Horatio faced questioning, the weight of their decisions pressed down on them, threatening to fracture the flimsy alliance they had formed. Each question from Detective Gaines chipped away at their resolve, unraveling the lies they had woven. They found themselves trapped in a web of their own making, forced to confront the consequences of their actions as their lives spiraled toward inevitable exposure. Verdant Hill had lost its innocence, and the tragedy of the Whitfield family would become a dark legend, a chilling reminder of how secrets, once unearthed, could destroy even the most carefully constructed lives. The disappearance of Marcus Whitfield rippled through Verdant Hill, casting a shadow over the town's serene winter landscape. The Whitfield family, once the epitome of respectability, was now at the center of whispers and speculation. The story Eleanor and Horatio had woven, that Marcus had left town on a work trip, was accepted at first by their friends and neighbors. But as days stretched into weeks, the story began to fray, and people's unease grew. Detective Valerie Gaines, who had been following the story from the beginning, found herself increasingly unsettled. The gaps in Eleanor's account nagged at her. Marcus had not been a man to disappear without a word. His routines had always been reliable, and he was known for his dedication to his work and community. A sudden departure without informing his closest friends or work colleagues simply didn't fit the profile. Gaines's instincts, honed over years of police work, told her that there was more to the story than a simple disappearance. It was the town gossip, Bernice Caldwell, who became an unlikely ally in the investigation's early days. Bernice's idle observations, her accounts of Eleanor's strange behavior, and her own suspicions about the Whitfield household hinted at something more sinister beneath the surface. Bernice recalled late-night noises coming from the Whitfield residence and Eleanor's increasingly frail appearance in the days following Marcus's departure. All these little fragments of information painted a picture that was anything but innocent. Detective Gaines decided to dig deeper, feeling a quiet but unshakable determination to uncover the truth. Her first step was to request phone records, hoping they might shed light on Marcus's last known contacts. She pored over call logs, noting the frequent exchanges between Marcus, Eleanor, and surprisingly Horatio. The records revealed a pattern of late-night calls between Eleanor and Horatio, an unusual amount of communication for a daughter-in-law and father-in-law. As Gaines continued to piece together the puzzle, she took a closer look at the timeline of Marcus's disappearance. The Whitfields claimed he'd left town one winter night, but oddly, there were no reports of anyone seeing him leave. The neighbors had noticed nothing unusual, except for a few lights on in the house well past midnight. Lights that Bernice was quick to mention. If Marcus had truly left of his own accord, why had there been no sightings, no evidence of his departure? The mounting inconsistencies only fueled Gaines's suspicions. The investigation took a new turn when Gaines received a call from one of her colleagues, who had been scouring financial records connected to the Whitfield family. She learned that Eleanor had recently withdrawn a large sum of cash, a withdrawal that seemed strangely timed and inconsistent with her typical spending habits. This discovery, combined with the suspicious phone records, cast a darker shadow over Eleanor's story. Gaines felt a chill as she began to form a theory. What if Marcus had never left town? What if he had never even left the Whitfield home? She was hesitant to voice her thoughts without concrete evidence. But the possibility of foul play gnawed at her, compelling her to look further. Her inquiries led her to search the outskirts of Verdant Hill, particularly the isolated fields and wooded areas where someone might attempt to hide evidence. One cold afternoon, accompanied by a forensic team, Gaines directed the search to a secluded field near the edge of town. As they combed through the area, she felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if she were on the brink of uncovering the truth. After several hours, a team member's shout broke the silence. Gaines hurried over, her heart pounding as she saw what they had uncovered, a patch of disturbed earth, partially hidden beneath a thin layer of frost. The forensic team carefully removed the soil, and soon, the horrifying truth was revealed. Marcus's body lay beneath the earth, his once strong frame reduced to a cold, lifeless form. The news of Marcus's discovery sent shockwaves through Verdant Hill, shattering the Whitfield's fragile veneer of normalcy. The townspeople, already uneasy with the whispers surrounding Eleanor and Horatio, were now gripped by horror and disbelief. How could such a tragedy have happened in their peaceful community? The question hung heavily in the air, casting a pall over the town. Detective Gaines's initial instincts had been validated, but the discovery only deepened the mystery. Now, the investigation shifted from a missing person case to a homicide inquiry, and Gaines knew that Eleanor and Horatio were at the heart of it. The forensic analysis revealed that Marcus's body bore signs of a struggle, a fatal stab wound and bruises that suggested he had fought back in his final moments. The crime, previously shrouded in mystery, now appeared to be a calculated act of violence. As Gaines conducted her initial interviews with Eleanor, she observed the widow with a practiced eye, noting every twitch, every hesitation. Eleanor maintained her composure, her answers guarded and careful, but her expression betrayed a trace of unease. She described Marcus's disappearance in clipped, rehearsed sentences, but her story held no warmth, no sense of genuine loss. It was as if she were reciting lines from a script, rather than speaking about the man she had once vowed to love and honor. Horatio's demeanor, on the other hand, was more telling. Though he tried to project an air of solemnity, There was a brittleness to his facade, a tension that made Gaines suspect he was hiding more than he let on. His hands fidgeted constantly, his gaze shifting whenever the conversation touched on the night Marcus was last seen. Gaines noted these signs, filing them away for later, certain that they would prove useful as the investigation deepened. The Whitfields' alibi unraveled quickly under scrutiny. Detective Gaines questioned the validity of the travel story, cross-referencing it with security footage and witness accounts, none of which supported the claim that Marcus had left town on his own. The evidence was damning, and Eleanor and Horatio found themselves cornered, their carefully constructed story collapsing piece by piece. Word of Marcus's body being found spread through Verdant Hill, and soon enough, the entire town knew that the Whitfield's secret had been exposed. Friends who had once admired Eleanor began to distance themselves, unwilling to associate with someone who was now the prime suspect in her husband's murder. The scandal grew, the details spreading like wildfire, and Verdant Hill transformed into a community haunted by betrayal and suspicion. In the days following the discovery, Detective Gaines intensified her focus on Eleanor and Horatio. Observing their interactions with forensic precision, she noted how Eleanor flinched at the mention of her husband's death, her eyes betraying fleeting glances of guilt and fear. Horatio, too, seemed to be buckling under the weight of their deception, his carefully controlled demeanor unraveling with each passing day. Eleanor's nights became sleepless, her mind plagued by the horror of her choices and the mounting evidence against her. Every shadow seemed to loom larger, every sound in the night a reminder of her transgressions. Her carefully composed exterior was beginning to crack, and Gaines knew it was only a matter of time before the truth surfaced. In her quiet moments, Eleanor replayed the events of that night, haunted by the sight of Marcus's final breaths. She remembered every detail, the scuffle, the fatal blow, the frantic scramble to conceal his body. The reality of what she and Horatio had done was a constant weight on her conscience, an inescapable reminder that she could never truly erase the past. Meanwhile, Detective Gaines continued her methodical approach, preparing to confront Eleanor and Horatio with the accumulating evidence. She understood that a direct accusation could cause them to shut down, so she adopted a strategy of slow erosion, carefully chipping away at their defenses. Each interview became more probing, each question designed to peel back another layer of their story, until only the raw truth remained. The forensic team's findings provided additional ammunition, tiny fibers from the blanket used to wrap Marcus's body, traces of soil consistent with the field where he was found, and fingerprints on the letter opener pointed to a premeditated cover-up. Gaines assembled the evidence piece by piece, constructing a narrative that left little room for doubt. She was confident that the case against Eleanor and Horatio was nearly airtight. Verdant Hill watched the drama unfold with a mix of morbid fascination and horror. The town had once idolized the Whitfield family, but now they were the subjects of fearful whispers, a reminder of how easily darkness could seep into even the most seemingly perfect lives. Gaines knew that the trial, when it came, would be sensational, a story that would haunt Verdant Hill for generations. But before the case could proceed to trial, there was one last step, the confession. Detective Gaines, prepared with every detail and every piece of evidence, prepared to confront Eleanor and Horatio with the irrefutable truth of their actions, pushing them to acknowledge the horror of what they had done. She hoped that, in those final moments, they might offer some glimpse of remorse, some indication that the enormity of their crime had pierced through their cold defenses. As the snow continued to fall on Verdant Hill, blanketing the town in a deceptive calm, Eleanor and Horatio sat on the brink, knowing that their carefully constructed lives were about to come crashing down. Gaines's relentless pursuit of justice had uncovered their darkest secrets, and there was no escape from the reckoning that awaited them. Detective Valerie Gaines knew that the case against Eleanor and Horatio was strong, but her instinct told her there were still pieces missing. She had seen investigations like this before, cases that, despite solid evidence, required one final push, one unbreakable link to bring the truth fully into the light. Gaines decided that patience and persistence would be her greatest assets. She was determined to dismantle their carefully constructed lies one thread at a time. The forensic evidence was damning. The soil found on Marcus's body matched samples taken from the field on the outskirts of Verdant Hill, confirming that he had been buried hastily, in an attempt to erase his presence from the world. The fibers recovered from his body matched the blanket Eleanor had reported missing weeks earlier, and the blood spatters found in the Whitfield home were consistent with the theory of a violent altercation. Gaines now had the physical proof that Marcus's death was neither an accident nor the result of a stranger's hand. All signs pointed directly to Eleanor and Horatio. Despite this, Eleanor and Horatio had remained silent on the matter. Gaines suspected they were in too deep, bound by mutual complicity and fear of the consequences. She could see the strain beginning to show on both of them. The restless movements, the haunted looks in their eyes, the way they avoided each other in public. It was as if they could feel the walls closing in, the carefully maintained distance between them now collapsing under the weight of shared guilt. Gaines knew that to break them, she would have to focus on their weakest link. After studying Eleanor closely during interviews, she sensed a fragility, a fissure in Eleanor's composed demeanor that only deepened with each passing day. It was Eleanor who would crack first. Gaines was certain of it. She decided to apply pressure on Horatio as well, ensuring that both suspects would feel the isolation and suspicion mounting against them. The first step in her plan involved isolating them during questioning. Gaines began conducting back-to-back interviews, gradually increasing the intensity of her inquiries while keeping Eleanor and Horatio separate. Each session left them more frayed, more unsettled, until they were both on edge, each one wondering if the other would hold up under the pressure. Eleanor's composure faltered under Gaines's subtle but probing questions. Her eyes grew darker, shadowed by sleepless nights and the growing weight of her guilt. Gaines asked her to recount, in excruciating detail, the days leading up to Marcus's disappearance, leaving no room for evasive answers. Eleanor's responses grew increasingly stilted, her voice faltering as she struggled to maintain the narrative. Gaines used every hesitation, every nervous glance to her advantage. She noticed Eleanor's discomfort each time the blanket was mentioned, her fingers unconsciously twisting a ring on her hand whenever the topic of Marcus's last known whereabouts came up. Gaines stored each of these observations, knowing they could serve as leverage when the time came. Meanwhile, Horatio's once steady demeanor began to unravel as well. Gaines noted how his attempts to deflect her questions only revealed more of his vulnerability. His answers grew shorter, more clipped, his voice betraying a barely concealed edge of frustration. The careful facade he had maintained was cracking, and Gaines knew it was only a matter of time before the stress became too much for him to bear. As she pieced together the evidence, Gaines's suspicions solidified into a chilling theory. The crime was not a spontaneous act of violence. It had been calculated, the result of festering emotions and fractured relationships. The forensic evidence, the phone records, and Eleanor and Horatio's changing behaviors all painted a picture of a family dynamic that had disintegrated into something dark and destructive. To confirm her suspicions, Gaines decided to re-interview neighbors and friends who had been close to the Whitfields. She wanted to know if anyone had noticed unusual behavior, strained interactions, or whispered conversations that might reveal the depth of the family's dysfunction. She returned to Bernice Caldwell, the ever-curious neighbor, hoping for a new detail that could deepen her understanding of what had led to Marcus's death. Bernice, more than willing to share her insights, recounted a recent interaction she had witnessed between Eleanor and Horatio. She described how she'd noticed Eleanor leaving Horatio's house late at night on multiple occasions, her face pale and strained. Bernice's observations, though based on nothing more than a hunch, were the missing pieces Gaines had been seeking. They confirmed her suspicion that the affair had been the catalyst for Marcus's death. With this new information in hand, Gaines prepared her strategy. She arranged another round of questioning, this time armed with Bernice's statements and additional forensic findings. Her goal was to intensify the psychological pressure on Eleanor, using every piece of evidence to weaken her already fragile defenses. When Eleanor was brought in for questioning, Gaines did not hold back. She described in excruciating detail the evidence found on Marcus's body, the soil, and the fibers that linked back to her. She spoke about the blanket and how its fibers had been found on Marcus's clothes. As each detail was laid bare, Eleanor's hands began to tremble, and she visibly paled, her breathing shallow. Gaines pressed on, describing the pattern of phone calls between her and Horatio, the late-night meetings, the withdrawals from her bank account. Every sentence served to tighten the noose around Eleanor's neck, each fact pushing her closer to the breaking point. Gaines observed her with unrelenting focus, waiting for that one moment, the slip that would betray her true emotions. Finally, Gaines asked her to recount her last memory of Marcus. The question was deceptively simple, but Eleanor froze, her mind racing for an answer that would align with the story they had concocted. She stammered, her voice barely audible, as she attempted to piece together a coherent response. But Gaines could see the lie forming before the words even left Eleanor's lips. Gaines leaned forward, her voice low and controlled. She reminded Eleanor that the truth would eventually surface, that the burden of lies was not something she could carry forever. With calm intensity, Gaines painted a vivid picture of Marcus's final moments, each word slicing through Eleanor's defenses, leaving her raw and exposed. Eleanor's composure shattered, her hands coming up to cover her face as tears welled in her eyes. The weight of her guilt had become unbearable, and Gaines knew that she had finally broken through. Meanwhile, Gaines turned her attention to Horatio, who had been watching the investigation unfold with growing dread. She met with him, presenting the mountain of evidence that had been gathered, each piece an indictment of his actions. Gaines recounted Bernice's observations, the late-night meetings, and the detailed forensic analysis that had uncovered the truth about Marcus's death. Horatio's face drained of color as Gaines laid everything bare, his gaze fixed on the table as he listened to the full extent of the evidence. As the questioning continued, Horatio's once confident demeanor crumbled. Gaines could see the fear in his eyes, the dawning realization that his carefully constructed facade had been destroyed. He avoided her gaze, his shoulders hunched as he sat in silence, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. In a final push, Gaines confronted Horatio with the damning evidence that linked him directly to Marcus's death. The fingerprints on the letter opener, the fibers that connected him to the burial site. She described the events of that night with chilling accuracy, piecing together the struggle, the fatal blow, and the hasty attempt to cover up the crime. Each detail was a nail in the coffin, a reminder that there was no escape from the truth. Faced with the overwhelming weight of the evidence, Horatio broke down, his hands shaking as he admitted to his role in Marcus's death. The confession was halting, punctuated by moments of silence, as he struggled to come to terms with the enormity of what he had done. He recounted the scuffle, the desperation, the moment he'd realized that he could no longer control the situation. As Horatio's words spilled forth, Gaines watched Eleanor, who sat across the room, listening to the confession with hollow eyes. She had known this moment would come, but hearing the truth laid bare was a new kind of torment. The facade of innocence she had maintained for so long crumbled, leaving her vulnerable and exposed, stripped of the lies that had sustained her. By the end of the interrogation, Gaines had everything she needed to build a case that would bring justice for Marcus. Eleanor and Horatio, once bound by a shared secret, were now separated by the weight of their individual guilt, each one facing the consequences of their actions. With the investigation complete, Gaines prepared to present the evidence to the district attorney, knowing that the Whitfield story would soon come to an end. Verdant Hill, once a community that had idolized the Whitfields, now regarded them with fear and suspicion, a reminder of the darkness that had lurked behind the family's carefully maintained facade. As Eleanor and Horatio were led away in handcuffs, the reality of their choices settled heavily upon them. The lives they had destroyed, the secrets they had kept, all of it had been laid bare, leaving them with nothing but the knowledge that their actions had irreversibly shattered the family they had once claimed to protect. The trial of Eleanor and Horatio Whitfield gripped Verdant Hill, drawing national attention as each harrowing detail was laid bare in the courtroom. Over the course of the proceedings, the prosecution meticulously presented the evidence. The damning phone records, the disturbing forensic findings, the neighbors' testimonies, and the chilling confessions from both Eleanor and Horatio. The jury, captivated and horrified, sat in silence, absorbing the full gravity of the crime. Horatio, whose actions had set the tragedy in motion, faced the harshest sentence. He was convicted of second-degree murder, receiving a prison term that would ensure he would spend the rest of his days behind bars. His remorse, though evident, could not lessen the severity of his actions or the consequences they carried. In a moment of reflection before his sentencing, he acknowledged the pain he had caused, recognizing the shattered lives and broken bonds that were now beyond repair. Eleanor, though equally complicit in the cover-up and betrayal, received a lesser sentence due to her role as an accessory after the fact. She would spend the next decade in prison, her once enviable life now reduced to a series of cold, unfeeling walls and the knowledge that she had destroyed her family through a series of irrevocable choices. The judge, stern and unyielding, emphasized that her punishment was a result of her betrayal of trust and her willingness to engage in deceit, even at the cost of those she loved. As the final verdicts were read, the residents of Verdant Hill felt a collective weight lift from their community. Yet the town would never be the same. The Whitfield family, once admired and respected, had left a scar that would take years to heal. Neighbors, who had once mingled freely, now regarded one another with a degree of caution, a reminder that appearances could so easily mask hidden turmoil. The tragedy served as a somber lesson, not just for Verdant Hill, but for all who followed the case. It underscored the dangers of betrayal and secrecy, revealing how deeply unchecked desire and dishonesty could corrode even the strongest relationships. The Whitfield story became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder that beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives, darkness could lurk, waiting for a moment to shatter the fragile illusion of control. For Detective Valerie Gaines, the case left an indelible mark. She had pursued the truth with unrelenting focus, bringing justice to Marcus and holding Eleanor and Horatio accountable. Yet even as the case closed, Gaines found herself reflecting on the complexities of human nature, the thin line between love and destruction, and the choices that had spiraled so devastatingly out of control. In the end, the Whitfield tragedy was remembered not just for its horror, but for the painful truths it unearthed about the consequences of deception and the limits of forgiveness. Verdon Hill, though scarred, would endure, forever marked by the story of a family who had fallen from grace, leaving behind a cautionary legacy that would echo for generations to come. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.